Hey, in this lesson I'm going to introduce variables, which are basically data containers we can store data of specific types. Instead of using literals all the time, it would be nice if we could store our values in data containers so that we can then reuse those values throughout our program, maybe change them later on. And it also makes things easier to read and to follow. So for example, let's say I do a console output statement, so I do cout 75. So I print the literal value 75 out to the console. What does that 75 mean exactly? If some other programmer comes along and reads your code, he's not going to know what 75 means. But if you save that value in some container, let's call it character health, then you can do console output the stream insertion operator and character health. That is much easier to read for someone else that comes along. In this way you can keep track of your character health and you can change it or modify it with time. So let's say later on in your program you add some health to it. Let's say you add 5 points to it, so it's now 80 instead of 75. Well, variables allow for this sort of thing, and so it's very fundamental and important. I'll talk about how you can declare and initialize variables and the differences between the two. I'll discuss variable naming conventions and rules. You can't just use anything as a name or identifier for your variable, so you cannot call your variable 1, for example, the number 1 that is, or 55 or something like that. There are specific rules that we have to follow, otherwise we'll get an error. I'll introduce the assignment operator, so let's say we want to assign, or in other words store the value 75 in some variable called character health. How do we do that? Well, we do that by using the assignment operator, so I'll talk about that. Okay, let's say we have some variable now, character health, which is initialized to 75. So in other words, we store 75 in that character health container. Now let's say we are coding some game writer, and later on in the program we can gain some health somehow. Let's say we want to gain 5 health somehow. How do we add and subtract and multiply and divide and all of that? Because we'll have to do addition somehow to add health to our character health, or subtraction to remove health points from our current character health. Okay, so I'll introduce the arithmetic operators and also arithmetic operator precedence. Then I'll explain how we can do console input from the keyboard, because again, let's say we have some container that stores our character health, and let's say we want to put in how much health our character has from the keyboard, or how much health our character loses or gains also from the keyboard based on the type of game that we are playing, right? Well, we need some way of entering the values from the keyboard, so I'll talk about that. Then I'll also introduce comments and tasks. We can basically write notes in our code files to make it easy for us to understand what's going on, and also for other programmers that come along and read our code files. We can even make to-do lists, and I'll show you how to do that. I'll also explain some of the different types that you have and some of the things that you have to look out with that, which brings me to the next slide. Before we jump into the lesson and start talking about variables, I would like to note that we have different types of variables. These are called fundamental types in the C++ language. And in this module C++ 101, we are going to focus primarily on the C++ language standard built-in types. For these, we don't require special header includes or special files. These again are the fundamental built-in types. There are 2 categories. We have integral types, which are whole numbers, such as 1, 2, 5, and so on. Then we also have floating point types. Remember, these are basically containers of specific types. So you can store a specific type of value in the container based on a type that you specify that container to be. Now, a floating point value is a value that has a whole part, so a whole number part, and you also have a fractional part which is separated by a decimal point. Whereas the integers do not have a decimal point and they do not have the fractional part. Again, I just wanted to mention these different categories, integral types and floating point types. And we will focus primarily in this lesson on the integral types. Now, we won't be discussing char all that much in this lesson. We will talk about char in more detail in the next lesson, including the floating point types. Okay, so the point of this lesson is not to introduce you to all of the different variable types. We are going to introduce them step by step as we go along. We also have a bool type, or in other words a boolean type, which can store true or false, and that is used for logic, if-else statement, selection, and so on. And we will discuss that type in future lessons as well. Alright, that is it for this introduction. Let's talk about variables next.